Dr. Jade McGlynn is a Russia specialist, or at least that's how she started. She is now a Ukraine specialist as well. She is also a research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She's a polyglot, political analyst with experience of living and working in many European countries. Jade has also been one of the strongest strategic and moral voices when it comes to the war against Ukraine. And in this conversation today, we're going to continue and build upon conversations we've had before about why this is the conflict of our times, why it is so important to understand Ukraine, and why it's so important to support Ukraine to victory. And if you're not aware, she also has some absolutely fabulous books, which we're going to put links of in the description of the video. And before we start, Jade, we should probably plug the shirt as well, because there will be a link in the description to that.
Yeah, my friend Sheka, who's from Pokrovsk, sent me a hoodie because he knows that I'm the strength of my feeling. I think of many of our feelings about Mariupol, and he was telling me that he's signed a contract with Shakhtar Donetsk, and so I thought, since I found out about an hour, I got the hoodie yesterday, and I found out about the contract about 20 minutes actually before this interview. So I thought, oh, I'll put the hoodie on, and then in case anybody else likes it, then at least they'll know that it exists. I think it's a cool brand. It's called Savoy.
It's a fabulous one. That's one of the nicest designs I've seen. And of course, one presumes that it will help. I know the word resilience, and we have to be careful with that, but any purchases of Ukrainian products help Ukraine to stay in the fight. Put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. He does a lot. He's done a lot of kind of volunteering since 2014, and certain proceeds go towards the Ukrainian armed forces. I'd have to double check to say exactly which amount, etc. I do not work in marketing for them, and they would hire me because I'm not very good at marketing. But I just think, in case people like it, because I like it,
Yeah,
that's where.
that's it. The authenticity, that's the essence of marketing in my book. So it's absolutely fine. We're going to dive into a whole load of topics, but let's start with, I think, the one that we were just talking about before we hit the cameras. And this was a sort of slight reminiscence of where we're at. We're in the fifth year of war. We're in the fifth year, I think, of reshaping history, reshaping the European continent. And when the kaleidoscope has stopped being in flux, that may well define the world we come to live in. Well, I won't be living in it because I'll be long expired, but over the next 150, 100 years. But one of the other realizations, I think, is that there are not that many people who are aware of this, who feel this, who really understand it. And maybe it felt like that in 1939. I'm not sure. I suspect from my own relatives that it was not, that people had a far greater awareness of the moment in history they were going through. But what's your sense of this, both the extraordinary moment we're in and perhaps the lack of seriousness with which many are approaching it?
Mhm. Feels like a general strategic blindness. I mean, because a lot of my research, sort of going back to 2014, was focused on Russian doctrine and just or Russian kind of information security doctrine, foreign policy concepts, just reading them and trying to understand like their vision of how they're narrating the world. And one of the just before we came on air, you were talking about, the end of history times. And I mean, going back into, well, 2007, actually, Putin's Munich speech, you could probably start it with, but a lot of my research focuses on when Putin returns, in 2012 to the presidency. And I mean, they constantly reference Fukuyama and the end of history, and they're really angry about it, this idea, and they scoff at it, they mock it, and at the time, obviously, you see these things as sort of interesting sort of data points of, oh, look, they're talking about Fukuyama again. But now I just I realize sort of how right they were in so many ways, as awful as it is to say about Russian doctrine. But because I think we do have this element in the West where we've forgotten that liberalism is an ideology. It's a choice. It's not an inevitability. Like that's how we like to live, and I like to live that way too. Just to put my cards on the table, all for liberal democracy. Very, very flawed. Lots of things wrong with it. Definitely wouldn't want to live under any other system. And I think that that sort of form of almost a teleological liberalism, this idea that everybody is inevitably on the path to democracy, that everybody is inevitably on a path to kind of ever greater forms of liberalism, and that there's almost something quite Marxist in its reading, the
I
sense of
was
like, oh,
about
we
to
want to
say
follow
there's
the
some
laws of history.
Hegelian process that you can't,
Yes,
you
yeah,
can't resist, which is an
yeah.
incredible inversion, actually.
Yes, it is. It's just this sense of like, well, we won. And I remember reading a really good book, Napredu Prošli. So it's in Serbian, unfortunately. So for those who are not Serbian readers, um, but it's about, politics of history and memory. And it came out in 2020. And I remember reviewing it for an academic journal. And essentially the argument was that we were all looking at the Berlin Wall in 1989, but we should have been looking at Yugoslavia because that was a better sign of what was going to come. And I agree with that position. I agreed with it then, or feared it was right, maybe would be better. So I think that this kind of this teleological liberalism as strategic blindness, I think that it's part of the reason that we haven't deterred Russia enough, and because we essentially for a long time failed to conceive of deterrence as a life requirement for Russia. We thought that we had this conviction that liberal democracy is history's natural destination, history's ended, that's strategic. And I'm not criticizing Fukuyama there because his actual book is much more complex than just saying, oh, history has ended. But, I'm more talking about the generic way that sort of assumption settled in certain foreign policy circles and among certain foreign policy elites. And this idea that kind of strategic competitors would converge towards a form of liberal democracy. I don't think it's just, we often talk about naivety, but I think it's more than that. I think it's that this belief, this teleological liberalism, is structured people's analytical frameworks, down to procurement decisions. What do you spend on? Well, you spend on things that will help push Russia towards being democratic. Even now you see some of that pressure. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't support, an idea of a different type of Russia, that they should, but, that shouldn't be, it's not realistic, is it? Right now, that shouldn't be what the focus is on. And I think that if essentially the practical consequences, if deterrence is something you maintain against actors who might threaten you, but for a long time we understood Russia incorrectly as a state in transition towards being more like us rather than a revisionist adversary, as happened to be the case, then you end up with, deterrence requires an adversary, and the framework that we were applying essentially precluded Russia being an adversary.
And there's a simpler idea as well, isn't there, which we could have learnt from Iraq, we could have learnt from any number of scenarios, which is authoritarian modes of governance eventually become paranoid about their security to the extent that they need to manufacture external threats. And the greater their internal insecurity, the greater that external threat. In some ways, I know historians never like using the word inevitability, but it seemed to me that Putin was always on a trajectory of the need to manufacture ever greater, external bogeymen in order to, in his perception, hold his regime together. I kind of suspect that actually it was never under threat, serious threat, in the way that perhaps he thought it was. But there's a kind of logic of inevitability towards greater and greater confrontation and war in that circumstance.
I think as well, you can get into situations of vicious circles because, of course, Russian security now is threatened because they invaded Ukraine. So now they get, droned, and there are attacks. And, we've even seen bits of Kursk or even bits of Belgorod sort of, taken for brief periods or not so brief periods. Um,
Chelyabinsk was hit for the first time, I think, last
yes,
week, and further they're penetrating into the so-called Russian heartland.
and I imagine it will only get worse, or for them, obviously worse depends on where you're sitting. And I am sitting in Ukraine, but um, because I understand it more as a sense of collective narcissism. So I think that Russia is that many many parts, many different segments of the Russian population are driven by this sense that, Russia is not respected, and in order to be respected, it has to be aggressive. I think we have to be honest and say that, the new US administration, or the return, the second Trump administration has kind of justified that logic. Because Russia was aggressive, and now it's been rewarded for that aggression against Ukraine. It's being treated, in Russia's view, more seriously than it was before. So I can see how those conclusions may, the Russian people may be seeing them as correct right now. I think a secondary issue is also, to come back to this point of deterrence, is that we aren't really engaging properly in any form of deterrence, and we haven't properly since well, certainly since the full-scale war started. Instead, I think we've really misunderstood, for example, like the grammar. If you think about Dima Adamski's work and like his analysis of Russian strategic culture, let's say, for example, in Russian nuclear orthodoxy, like in Western framework, we treat nuclear escalation as a catastrophic rupture. That's a threshold that you would cross only an absolute extremist if your existence was threatened. But in Russian doctrine, they use nuclear signaling as a form of everyday pressure. It's just like an instrument for everyday pressure that they calibrate, and they can use it to manage Western intervention below the threshold of direct conflict. And you then have this asymmetry. So Russian nuclear messaging throughout the war in Ukraine is just misread. Western governments can't distinguish the performative nature of it. They can, they get better over time, but certainly in the beginning, it was just ridiculous. They couldn't distinguish the performativity from actual kind of the actual sort of more operational escalation signals. Now there are a number of kind of exceptions to that rule, and obviously after the 2022 liberation of Kharkiv region and right bank Kherson, you did see a few operational escalation signals, and then deterrence was engaged in a proper way. So I don't want to give this off as a blanket statement, but I do think that in general, the over focus on escalation and, oh, would that make Russia escalate, has essentially just been seeding any credible deterrence. I think it's been a gift to Russian coercion, because Russia learned that nuclear signaling imposed self-deterrence on Western decision making.
Absolutely works. And that book, for people, we'll put a link in the description as well. Actually had it to hand. You won't be able to see it here, but Adamski, The Russian Way of Deterrence, which I have to admit I hadn't read before, but I think, as you say, it's an essential. I realize now it's an essential thing, grounding, to sort of understand what's going on. You have people like Medvedev being rolled out. I'm not sure if anyone takes him seriously, but then you have the arch Bond villain of this, which is Karaganov. Now, they didn't come up with these doctrines, they didn't come up with these coercive manipulation processes in the context of this war. They're building on decades of testing and learning what works in terms of manipulation of Western response, aren't they?
Yes, and I think it's interesting in a way I think it's interesting that you thought about that you've brought up this point, because so often, so much, when we're talking, if we're talking about, let's say, information manipulation, I often think that actually we're not really talking about information manipulation. We're talking about the manipulation of people, finding where people's weak spots are, or different publics' weak spots are, and exploiting them. Because not
Cognitive
everything that Russia
warfare, I
writes.
think, as
Yes.
Maria Belinska calls it.
Sorry, what did you say?
Maria Belinska, I think, calls it cognitive warfare, and that's the
Yeah,
new front.
cognitive
Yeah.
warfare is actually, when it's used correctly, I have a lot of time for cognitive warfare as a phrase, but it's just I sometimes I get I okay. I how to explain it? People, when cognitive warfare, which I think is a good term as Maria Belinsky uses it, but when it came about, people were often talking about Russian cognitive warfare, and I'm talking here about Westerners, not about Ukrainians. And it wasn't really a term in Russian. I mean, it is in some quite like esoteric literature, but often as a translation from the West, or a description of what the West is doing against Russia. And I'm always a little bit skeptical of, these new things that we've discovered Russia does. And then when you look at it, it's either just us using like, like, oh, Maskirovka, and like that just
Yeah.
means deception. We have a perfectly good English word for
Or
that,
it's them doing an old thing, which they've always done. They just sort of tweaked it
Yeah, yeah,
slightly.
exactly. Yeah, as if it's something, like brand new. And I mean, it's funny, I was at a conference in Sweden recently, and it was about propaganda generally. And I'd been invited to talk about, is Russian propaganda postmodernist? And my argument was, no, we are postmodernist. Russian propaganda exploits, the problems in societies as they exist and makes them worse. Just as it has since, the times of active measures, just as Thomas Rid and so many others have documented so well, exploits problems that exist and makes them worse. It spread lies. It does anything just to encourage chaos. But often the postmodernism we see in Russia's approach, particularly, since 2012 or 2014, that's actually just us looking at our own postmodernism in the mirror. And unless we can, tackle the issues of our own social resilience, our own kind of trust in institutions, Russia's going to have a field day. And the problem, lies within us. And you can see, because certain countries, countries with higher trust are less vulnerable, higher interpersonal and intersocial trust, they are less vulnerable to these types of attacks. And ultimately, you're never going to be able. There is a lot more that can be done, and I'm not suggesting for a second, that certainly education from a young age, like they have in Finland and Estonia, about critical reading, understanding one's own kind of engagement with reading news isn't useful. That's so very useful. And I'm not at all suggesting that the platforms don't have a huge role to play in this. But I think we also have to understand that, some of the problems that are being exploited are very real, and there are sometimes some pretty good reasons why people are angry with institutions or why there isn't a sense of social cohesion. And I appreciate that's a much harder issue to fix than, developing pretty graphs in different colors to show all the different ways Russia has lied to us. But I do think that from a purely defensive strategy, it would be far more productive for us to focus on healing some of those, I suppose, kind of wounds in our own societies to make ourselves more. I think that would make us far more resilient than just creating sort of fact checking, because often what Russia is appealing to isn't that somebody believes in this or that fact. It's a broader narrative and story and point of pain that they can exploit. Yeah.
And I think there's, I mean, dare I say, it's that sense of innate rightness, whether it
Mhm.
aligns with reality or facts or not. It's I'm right, and I'm going to do the thing that I'm going to do just because I think the phrase comes out, I can. And that comes through, I think, to me, when you put aside all of the rhetoric and whatever, Russia's doing what it's doing because it can, because no one's going to stop them. And they realize that no one's going to stop them because we've entered this, as you say, more process-led, more managerial epoch where we resign ourselves to historical process, where we resign ourselves, as you say, to ideology. We resign ourselves to a very managerial way of doing things and almost an inevitability, not a nihilistic one, but a sort of inevitability of the system and the machine. And I know this is at least esoteric, but you mentioned 2007 and the Munich speech, and there are certain sort of pivotal moments or pivotal texts which help understand it. I'm going to throw in a really curious one and see what you think here. Zapiski is Podpolya.
Mhm.
Dostoevsky is an interesting one because there's an idea in there which then aligns with Alexander Etkind, which is that when faced with modernism, when faced with the machine, the only thing that the Russian mind can do is to reject it, is to try to go back to, let's say, a sort of primitivism, which may be entirely self-destructive, but that's the only thing to show that you are a conscious human, you're alive. And I think Dostoevsky's point was that when faced with, say, Victorian industrial perfection, as he called it, the only reasonable response of the Russian is to go back to superstition and to just smash it.
Um, I don't know. I mean, obviously you're talking on a certain sort of more philosophical level. I think I probably wouldn't put it in those terms. If not only because, there are some parts of Russia that are so incredibly modern, not least, their unfortunately some of their innovation cycles, when we see, what Rubicon is doing. Obviously it's awful, and I hope Rubicon is totally destroyed, the drone unit. But like, they're really good at their job. Like, there's no point in pretending that they're not. I think that in general it's much easier to destroy than it is to create. And Russia, whilst trying to prove its greatness, that it feels, it inherently has this sort of inherent mission or messianism, often wants to show its ability to cause effect. And I don't think it has the capacity to create. It certainly doesn't have the capacity to create something um, that people want to sort of emulate. And so it's much easier to destroy. But I do also think, I always think back to Jeffrey Hoskins and his description of the Russian, of the conquest, Muscovy's, I suppose, conquest of Siberia, and how it set up this pattern whereby the Russian state, I mean, to the extent we can call it Russia then, but people can forgive me the sort of anachronism, hopefully, will keep on pushing until it reaches a firm frontier, either because that's a geographic frontier, you've got a huge frozen, so you've got a huge sort of scary sea full of sharks, you don't want to go there, or a political one, or one that can be put in kind of militarily. And only at that point will it start to engage, once it's met that firm frontier that it can't just push through. Only at that point will it start to engage politically. And I think about it so often in the context of, they seem to have died down now, but the context of sort of ceasefire discussions, that until Russia meets that boundary, it will just use the discussions as another means of kind of trying to reach its military ends. It's only once it understands that it cannot reach its military and its political ends that it will actually start to engage properly. And I think in a way it links in back as well to the discussions we've been having from the start of this talk about, deterrence, and even in the information space. I mean, at the moment, if we talk about Russian hybrid warfare, we talk about it purely in defensive terms. We talk about it, I mean, Westerners, we talk about it in terms of resilience, protection, hardening infrastructure, pre-bunking, platform takedowns, etc. And I think that that's a pretty strategically insufficient approach. I think we also need to engage. If we're going to deter in the hybrid domain, we need not only the capacity to absorb and recover from these attacks, but also, I think, the credible threat and demonstrated willingness to impose asymmetric costs on the attacker.
Absolutely. We're into the area of my favorite topic, which is combat propaganda, which is where we don't just remain on the defensive, but we, as you say, not only create a hard barrier, but show that we can punch back if we need to, and even though that's not our default position or desire. That leads me to the idea here, and we I think we talked about it in the very first conversation, is that our mode of deterrence is and remains extremely performative, and Russia has, despite its weakening military in some respects, strengthening others, it has retained escalation dominance from the very first time I think we talked in 2022. That hasn't changed, and we are still engaged in a performative type of deterrence, not quite really taking it seriously, not trying to inhabit the Russian mind to say, well, what would they actually find genuinely deterrent? Whereas we're just asking the question, well, what can we afford to do, or what do we think deterrence looks like? You have a lot more experience talking to people, on the inside. Is this accurate, or is it perhaps a mischaracterization of, what the West's response to Russia?
I mean, I think probably quite clearly both of us are thinking specifically about the UK, maybe because we're British. Um, just because there is a difference, obviously, between like Southern Europe and Northern Europe, obviously, and their response to the war. So, but broadly speaking, I think that you're correct. Unfortunately, I think there's a couple of aspects. One is, it is just so performative. We seem to think, I mean, in itself, I suppose, takes us back to some discussion around postmodernism. But you think that if you just say something, then it makes it true. Sometimes it's the impression that I get from certain politicians. And it's funny. I'm organising an event with the Kennan Institute in London for December, and I'm very annoyed with the Kennan Institute that I've now become the type of person who knows what they're doing in December. But that's a different issue. But the idea of what we want to speak about is like is words during the war, and all of these different phrases, stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, or temporarily occupied territory, just all of these different phrases and the different ways that they do help to get across reality or to convey reality. And in some cases, they utterly occlude it. And, stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, or support Ukraine, particularly by this point in 2026. These are two of the phrases that one day I think I'm just going to end up in a black room, like screaming because somebody has said this phrase for just one time too many. As long as it takes for what? As long as it takes for Ukraine to be ground down, or as long as it takes for Russia to collapse. I mean, what is the actual strategic endpoint? Like, what are we waiting for? Oh, Putin dies, and then we all have the lovely fluffy Russia that somehow, for some reason, always escapes us, probably because the West did something wrong, because obviously the West is the only region of the world that has any agency, and Russia has no responsibility for any of its actions beyond as reactions to something that the US did wrong in
Has never
2000.
invaded anyone in its history. Yeah,
No,
that's the other.
no,
No, no.
no. There's no, again, no pattern recognition to be found. But I think as well, the other issue is, and it's obviously a very live conversation, particularly after Lord Robertson's sort of intervention, is even quite often when I'm dealing with various governments, I won't just pick on the UK, but sometimes the UK is especially annoying in this sense. So maybe I will pick on the UK. Um, I actually don't think that the policy is wrong. And I don't think that, I mean, if we think about the Strategic Defence Review, it's difficult to say it was a strategy because, of course, in some ways, because the money and the ways to actually achieve it weren't there. And the whole point of a strategy is that you then kind of go on to implement. But in terms of the strategic thinking around it, it's very hard to read the Strategic Defence Review and strongly disagree with anything that's in there. I mean, I think it's a very good review. I didn't,
Mm.
the
And
problem
then
is
Fiona
that then
Hill,
it's not
Lord Robertson
implemented.
are pretty, decent when it comes to analysing the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a very good analysis, and it's a pretty good suggestion of what should be done. But the issue is in the implementation, and that's consistently where I find the problem is. For example, I don't think that most British people are aware that huge chunks of our foreign policy are just implemented by, for-profit contractors. I, to be honest with you, wasn't aware of that until Ukraine. I wasn't aware of how large charities worked, and I have to say, I've not been overwhelmed by the efficiency and lack of waste. And sometimes I find it frustrating when people in government will ask me, okay, well, how are we supposed to do X, Y, Z if we're not getting any more money? And I just think, but you waste such obscene amounts of money. I see it. You just waste it. And in general, I would put it down to a lack of expertise. And also, I think some weird, to be honest, I would describe it almost as a sort of fetish with outsourcing things to people who have even less expertise, and are just sort of generalist. And I don't have a problem. Look, if it's for profit, and because you're using a for-profit company that's making everything way more efficient and you're getting more impact, great. This is not an ideological point. The point here is about results. Um, but I don't see them, and it's a shame because, the policies behind some of the funding, for example, that's come from various European governments to help create a more to help strengthen certain Ukrainian institutions, to help ensure that civil society have the resource support that they need to be able to really engage with government. I think that they're good policies. I think the issue is the way that it's being implemented and whether or not it's appropriate for us to be applying things like a stabilization framework, for example, to a country like Ukraine that is in full-scale war. Because to me, it isn't. And whoever I've raised that with, people agree, but then people just say, oh, well, it can't be done. And I don't really understand why, because I'm quite certain that Moses himself did not develop the stabilization framework. So I imagine there must be some way that you can not apply the stabilization framework. It can't be beyond the wit of man or the wit of Whitehall to do this, because it makes it completely almost just like perverts everything that's trying to be done, because you have to consistently link it back to how does this meet a stabilization framework that is entirely not fitted to what our foreign policy should be in a country undergoing, a war aimed at destroying its very existence. That's not about stabilization post-war. This isn't like Bosnia 2006. This is Ukraine 2026, where it's still getting bombed every day. As a final point as well, I suppose, to come back to your performativity, we have to remember that even if we had very good messaging, which I don't think we do, but even if we did, deterrence isn't just cognitive. There's also, you have to have some credible military capability. And recently, I've been really happy to see some of the things the UK is doing. For example, um, with air defense, which was a frankly terrifying situation we were in, and also, some of the new drones that are being created. I've heard some very, very good feedback from Ukrainian soldiers who, to be honest with you, are not inclined generally to give good feedback about Western-made drones, to put it mildly.
No, and
Um,
they're not going to say nice things just for the sake of
no, they
it.
don't. They don't do
No,
that. That's
no, they
true.
absolutely
You get
don't.
honesty. They're too busy. But I do think we still, we have this kind of escalation gap, as it were, between you've got Storm Shadow and then you've got nuclear weapons. And I know we're working on creating things to fill it, but why we need to speed it up. When I see the kind of the cycle here, I mean, it's difficult for me in some ways because I don't know war. I just know this war. And so I don't really have any other proper comparative points. Of course, I know about World War II or I know about the Vietnam War, but in terms of having deeply studied, I don't come from a sort of military, kind of military background in any way. I just know this war because I come here a lot to East Ukraine and, because I've studied it since 2014. Often studying different aspects, but you pick up on different things, and not least because when you're being bombed, you pay attention to these things, right? Because you want to stay alive, basic human instinct. And if I'm buying, let's say, I buy electronic warfare, sometimes some of my friends who are snipers, and I pay for it to be upgraded. Um, and I can tell by how many weeks or months or whatever that they need, between it being sent off, how quickly the innovation cycle is going at different points. Sometimes it slows down, sometimes it speeds up. Um, and then when I see the sort of procurement cycles that people talk about in the EU or in the UK, and I think, well, we'll all be dead. We'll all be dead by the time you've got the
Yeah.
project design.
Well,
Um,
generations of drones have already been and gone in one of those
yes,
procurement cycles. Yeah.
yes. Exactly. And I mean, there are so many Western drones. I mean, well, this is a slightly different topic to get into, but there are so many Western drones that just they arrived too late. By the time they've arrived, even if let's just presume they were good and worked, which is a massive assumption to make, to be honest, when it comes to us. But let's
Yes.
make that
Let's
assumption and be
let's make that
kind.
wild conjecture there. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's presume that they worked and they were great. By the time they arrive still, they don't work and nobody, there aren't the men here to sit down with a screwdriver and kind of fix them and get them up to date. So they just sit in
Mm.
warehouses. And I mean, Russia can see what the Western procurement trajectories are. And I'm sorry, but it doesn't signal to me, and I doubt it signals to them, um, capability, it doesn't signal to me or to them probably any sort of form of deterrence credibility. I do appreciate that now there are these huge investments coming, but even the way that that is happening isn't just about money. It's about the way that the money is being spent. Is it being spent genuinely because you want effect? Or is there still lots of this sort of proceduralism of, oh, well, we have to do it this way? And I mean, I find that so tiring. You speak to people, you say, okay, why don't you just go and work with, look, this manufacturer is making X amount of drones. It's got some Ukrainian state contracts, but basically it works directly, to this unit, and they're doing these things, and that's something that could be relevant to your country, for example, just in a conversation. So, oh no, because we have to do due diligence properly, etc., etc. Well, they can't be doing due diligence that properly if they keep on spending, tens of millions of pounds at least in companies who create things that don't work and can't fly. So I'm not sure due diligence just feels like some weird dance that people need to do. I'm all for due diligence if it's actually looking into how things are in reality. But so often I see these processes, I see terrible things and huge waste of money being able to happen despite people having gone through these processes. It's not just that the processes are annoying or that they slow things down. It's also that they do not work to do what they say they do. They are completely pointless. And I'm all for processes and transparency where they add rigor and where they protect, the taxpayer who also has a right to know, if they're investing in something or if their money or their taxes are being sent to something, that it's being done at least, with a reasonable understanding of the risk that could be involved and so on. But what's happening at the moment is just this weird bureaucracy that some people know how to game. And nobody really benefits from it. Not our readiness, not the taxpayer who probably doesn't want their money wasted on nonsense or terrible things, and certainly not Ukraine.
But it seems that often it's a box ticking exercise. It's a
Yeah.
salve for people's conscience. And that ultimately has to come down to the fact that we do not feel we are under existential threat. Ukraine has, I think, several things going for it. One is it's fighting for its life. I mean, that's not a positive, but that's it's a motivator to, as you say, innovate and do things. It's not a, as one of my friends in Lviv called it, Ukraine's not a luxury country, he called it, in that they have minimal resources, so you have to think very carefully about how to deploy those resources. But then there's, and I'm gonna use a sort of mild profanity here, there's the Ukrainian bullshit detector, which is they can smell out hypocrisy and they're not going to go, mostly, they're not going to take part in some performative process that has no impact because they're not. The best people are going to align themselves with things that are effective, that are not going to get them killed, or has a lower probability of that, that's going to have an impact that's actually, where you can measure cause and effect rather than just going through a performative process. Are these some of the things we should be learning? And how do we learn them? How do we re-import those into our mature luxury democracies?
I don't know. I mean, I actually don't know if we can learn them. And I mean, Ukraine also didn't learn them in all places until it had to. It's funny, I was talking to a friend last night, a soldier, and we were talking about this very issue, basically, how like has to Ukraine just has to do everything as right as they can. And he was making the point, which is his point to make and not mine, that he was still unhappy about a number of things and how they worked. But he was saying, we don't have the time. We all the time we had to kind of, do trial and error and mess around. We wasted that time. And I just thought, well, that's the bit we're in now. Like we being the West, like we're in that bit where we're being given time and we're just wasting it.
We frittered it away. It's like that revision period before, an exam
Yeah.
where you sit
Honest
and
tomorrow.
you sit and
Yeah.
doodle and then like I really should get down to it. But unfortunately, yes, it seems that when we're going to have to come under some kind of kinetic existential pressure. And that's kind of what I wanted to sort of focus on here because there's a couple of ideas we talked about in our first conversations which still hold now, which is deeply disappointing. And one of those is the very simple idea that Russia is not looking for small tactical gains. This war is not an extension of diplomacy. Rather, diplomacy is an instrument of war, and war has come to define Putin's Russia. It's come to define every aspect of the economy. It's come to define many relations, even if people don't want to think about it. Incomes, everything is dependent on that war machine and indeed, the regime's survival. And not simply war itself, but a war that will transform international relations, export and Russify to some extent the global order into a global disorder. And yet we're sitting back as if this is still a regional problem, as this is still something that could result in a diplomatic process and agreement. We saw Merz just yesterday coming out with the most outrageous, frankly, nonsense and wishful thinking, talking about, an eventual inevitable peace with Russia, stabilization, to use the word there, and that somehow Ukraine will need to, recognize as legal its amputated limbs, its territories, in some way to join this sort of legalistic farce that Western civilization has become. Sorry, I'm ranting a little bit there, but
No, I'm getting into it.
but let's pick some of the stuff there. Russia's not going to stop, is it? Because their vision is so much greater, or Putin's vision of what he wants is so much greater than what we recognize is at play.
I agree. My reading of the situation is and has been probably since summer of 2023 when I kind of understood what the West was and was not going to do. because that things were a lot more flexible in the first kind of couple of years. Um, my reading is that Russia will Russia's war aims haven't changed. They still do not want Ukraine to exist as a sovereign, independent country. There may be different methods to doing that. For example, they may accept a ceasefire if it was deeply, deeply unfair and they thought that they could then use that space to sort of completely destabilize Ukrainian society so it was unmanageable and chaotic, and then they could sort of take control that way. I think that there's an openness in terms of how they achieve those methods. Obviously, they tried to achieve it using different methods over the years, but the end result, the desired end result hasn't changed. But I don't think it stops at Ukraine. They don't want to have Ukraine. They want to have Ukraine just for the sake of having Ukraine because for ideological reasons in terms of Russia's own self-conception. But it's also about Russia's weight in the world and Russia trying to force reality to meet its vision of itself in the world. So this is what you see in the occupied territories, for example. There's this huge emphasis on just destroying anything Ukrainian because Russians tell themselves these areas are Russian. And so they have to enforce that reality. They're making the reality match their perception of reality by just destroying everything Ukrainian. They also believe that they should have a say. We know this from the 2021 ultimatum, that they should have basically a decisive say over Europe's security architecture. They should have a decisive kind of basically a buffer zone. We see how unimpressive and chaotic sometimes NATO can feel. I would, if they succeed in Ukraine, which I don't think they will, for what it's worth, but it cannot be ruled out. If they succeeded in Ukraine, I don't see why they wouldn't try something in a NATO member state. Not necessarily a huge, not driving tanks to Berlin, but some kind of incursion to see how NATO reacts, probably assuming that NATO will not react that strongly, that there will not be Article 5, that it will lead to arguments, that it will lead to certain countries saying things like, oh, well, let's make sure, because, Russia denies that it's that those FSB are the same FSB or those crew are the same GRU people, that it has. It says that their GRU people are just on holiday,
Yes, in
all this
Salisbury.
nonsense.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah, exactly. And some people will fall for it out of not even fall for it because they believe it, but just out of fear because they
yeah,
want to believe it. And because they don't want to be dragged into a war with Russia, which is a completely
yeah.
sane thing to think. But I
Exactly. They'll
also
say, we know it's Russia, but we don't want to provoke them further, not thinking that provocation is inevitable and actually, they're going to act whether they're provoked or not. In fact, provocation may discourage them from further steps. That's part of the incremental testing, isn't it?
it's showing the border. It's showing, no, there's a border, guys, and you're not coming through this one. And I think trying to think of how to put in that border. I mean, a couple of years ago, I spent a lot of time working on Sky Shield and the idea of, can we put in borders over, critical nuclear plants? Can we put in borders? I mean, obviously it's not a literal border, but if you can put in those actual, it just creates this sense of like, no, stop. And at least then we've minimized the area. It's not ideal. There are no ideal solutions here. It's definitely not ideal. But at least then you minimize the area to focus it on the east, and it gives certain, it gives certain parts, it gave certain parts, it would have given certain parts of the Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian military, some breathing space. They don't need to worry about those areas, or they don't need to worry, about this or that. You can produce properly. But whilst a lot of that planning was then taken away as part of the coalition of the willing, that's all for after a ceasefire. And as I've said elsewhere, to me, this is just like the amount of planning that goes into the coalition of the willing for after the ceasefire. It reminds me of, measuring curtains and thinking what patterns go together for the house that you're going to buy when you're a multimillionaire, but you at no point are interested in how you become a multimillionaire.
It has a whiff of that, doesn't it? And
Yeah, yeah.
someone I admire in it is in Kharkiv, and they were doing a charity to fix homes and put windows in and rebuild roofs, and they were having great success. But then the houses they'd fitted out started getting hit again, and they were like, "Well, there's a time and a place for this, but what we need to do now is build drones." So this lady is an internationally renowned florist who, with a team of teenage girls, builds some of the best engineered killer drones in Ukraine, and that I find that inspiring. And some people would find
Me
that sort
too.
of, slightly, but no. But there's a serious point there is until the invader is injected, until that hard border is created, then all the rest is just it's doodling in the notepad, ahead of the big exam, as it were. It's a lovely image which a friend of mine who's in the cultural forces, Michael Scott, created, and it's Ukrainian servicemen, if you know the theme of Game of Thrones, holding the door.
Oh,
There's this phrase, hold the door, and you've got Ukrainian servicemen in a sort of medieval style, holding against this door, and obviously you've got, zombies with Z helmets trying to creep through the door. And I just thought that was incredibly evocative of what Ukraine is doing. But while they're holding the door, are we preparing the next bulwark, the next door? I fear not. I know we've covered that, but I wanted to dive a little bit more into this idea of hybrid warfare because there was this book out, about if Russia's going to attack, and it felt very outdated because it focuses on the Narva scenario. It focuses on carving out a little bit of territory to challenge NATO. I fear that the test when it comes is going to be far less obvious, but on a far, far greater scale. It could, for instance, be a full-scale hybridized war, but spread out over days, weeks, and months. A kind of boil the frog sort of strategy. And what is happening with Trump, it seems, is an effort to withdraw training, resources, create a high degree of dysfunctionality in NATO. I almost fear, in my paranoid way, that this is preparing the ground for weakening the defensive power, deterrence power of Europe and the coordination power of Europe almost intentionally. But ahead of what is the question that pops into my head. Do you have similar thoughts, or where does your mind go when you observe what's been going on, and whether a full-scale European Pearl Harbor, hybridized Pearl Harbor type incident is a possibility?
I think we're already in this kind of these early stages of the war, and whether or not it will be, a massive attack on the German banking infrastructure, for example, or an attack on some of the critical infrastructure in the UK, or whether or not they'll go and try and take Dalgav pills. I think it will all depend on when they feel emboldened to do so. The idea that, oh, okay, well, they don't have the capability, that I feel less confident on, not because I think that they do have the capability, but they obviously didn't have the capability to take all of Ukraine, and yet they still marched on in with their medals ready. So I think there's a real disconnect between, sometimes, intent doesn't equal capability. And if they're really intent on doing something, and they've made it really clear to us that they are intent on like reshaping the European security order. So I don't see any reason to not believe, like it's pretty consistent line, but in their doctrine in terms of how they see, what Russia's place in the world should be. So I think we're already in it, and we're almost talking about what will be the next steps and tactics rather than probably one moment, where we go from like peace into war. And I think the quicker we understand that there isn't this distinction, there isn't this hard line or threshold that's crossed, or that it's already been crossed, and start to prepare for it and start to think not, oh, well, we mustn't pick a side, we must think through all of these things. We're already on a side. And we can defend it, and we can do things that weaken the other side, or we can use the last few years or maybe months of luxury that we've got left to ignore it and then cry and say, oh, what's the government doing, when it all goes wrong, which I think is not a good strategy, as maybe implied by some of the sarcasm in my voice. Everybody has to take responsibility. How do you want, how do you want to live? Do you want to? I'm out here doing a lot of interviews for research, a Leverhulme funded research project at King's College London, and I'm interviewing people who lived under occupation. So they're not in occupation now; they left, but they have lived under occupation. And some of the conversations we've got into is kind of, what is occupation? Like, when did you know that the occupation had started? Because obviously, depending where the people came from, occupation was experienced really quite differently. Mariupol, of course, has an especially horrific experience leading up to occupation, but that bit was the siege was not occupation for some parts of the city. Occupation only happened after the siege for some parts of the city. Um, and what they describe is just that sense of just having no right. So like somebody comes in, soldiers come into your house, they just take stuff that they want. You can't do anything about that. You cannot stop them. The best you can do is just try and look at the floor and hope that they don't rape you, to be honest, or kill you or take you off somewhere. They can do whatever they want, and there is nothing you can do about it. I think that people don't, it's so hard to get anybody, particularly in Britain, who's been like, we haven't been invaded since 1066 successfully at least. And that sort of experience is very unlikely to happen to Britain. So how do you try to get this idea of what we're up against? You know, you can't just appeal, but to a certain extent, you can appeal to people's morality. And you know, the British people are very pro-Ukrainian, and I'm always quite touched by how many Britons like still care about Ukraine, to be honest. Because it's not in the news that much, you know, not everybody's like you, Jonathan, doing their bit to keep it there. Um, but it can't just be about morality, because there are lots of terrible things happening to people around the world. It's not just in Ukraine. It has to be as well about national interest. I think we need to move from that, oh, let's support Ukraine, to understand that this is cooperation, that we need to know, we need to learn the lessons that Ukraine is learning, because otherwise we're going to have to learn them ourselves the really, really hard way, like Ukraine has learned them. Right now, we're still in a luxurious and privileged position that we can work with Ukraine, we can help them. You know, it's transactionalism. Okay, what do they need? They need money, they need some resources, they maybe need some places to build. And then from that, we can learn, you know, we can take in a fair, not exploitative way, maybe some of the IP so that we can use it, so that we can adapt it to our own countries. Like we need to be cooperating with Ukraine. It can't just be seen as, oh yeah, we will help you, support you, because Ukraine is basically the best security guarantee the continent has against Russia. They're the only army that know how to fight, that are ready to fight, and that have, you know, the products essentially, apart from, let's say, an air defense. So even there with the interceptor drones, they're doing a lot better. But there are still some areas, naturally, big ticket items where, you know, European kind of industrial heft is needed. But broadly, I think, you know, we're all doomed without Ukraine.
This is it. And there's an interesting point there, which Vladimir Ermolenko sort of made to me last year, which really kind of struck me forcefully, which is we still focus on, even if we are doing the right things, we're focusing on the products and the supply chains and whatever, almost ignoring that none of that really matters unless you have people who have the will to fight and sacrifice everything, frankly, to do that. And Ermolenko's, I guess, sort of, you know, intellectualization of this is that after the Second World War, we had a period where individual valor was valued. And we can think of there's a lot of films in the 60s which you still have that sense of there's individual heroism, and you can put an individual not so much on a pedestal, but you can say this wouldn't have happened without the courage of that person, without the sacrifice of that person. But as we got into later decades, valor became far more abstract, far more institutionalized, to the point now where, you know, you're not allowed to have heroes, or it's seen as slightly unseemly to see victory and heroism as something that's even real. Not in Ukraine, though. Ukraine, it's well understood that will and that sacrifice are the only things holding everything together.
I agree. I agree with that reading. I think essentially Ukrainians are heroes in a post-heroic age. But I like heroes. I don't want a post-heroic age. I like the heroic age. I'm just sad
Absolutely.
they're needed.
It is sad. The last bit then, because I know you've got a lot of stuff on, and you've been extraordinarily generous with your time. Could we focus a bit still on occupation? Because it seems to me there's a fundamental failure of historical imagination here. Um, the failure then translates into policy, unfortunately, which is that somehow our lack of imagination means that we cannot see the context of occupation for what it is and the way you described it. You know, the absolute capriciousness, you know, throwing the roulette wheel or the dice every day as to whether you survive or don't, whether you have a horrific experience or don't. And yet, in the Western imagination, occupation is not understood in that way. It's not understood in that sort of visceral fashion. It's almost as if, it's a cosplay war. It's almost as if it's like, oh, well, it's not on the level of the brutality of, say, in the Second World War, the Nazis and so on. How do you see, this as that sort of failure of imagination, despite the fact that history is immensely popular in the public? How can we create that visceral sense of what's going on and then translate that into real policy that responds to that?
It's funny because in some ways I almost think the question's not in the viscerality, but actually in just really, well, maybe it's there's so much that needs to be done when it comes to talking about the occupied territories, that it's sometimes hard to know where to start, and everybody will have a different role. So I'm an academic. I mean, what I'm working on is I've been given seed funding at King's College London to set up an occupied territories insights hub, and the idea of this is to use some of the masses of data and information that is there, to work with it, to provide it as kind of analysis, to just provide it sometimes, databases. Obviously, we're going through a very strict form of ethics review, so I should be very clear that the databases, are only of certain types. We have to be very, very careful. And to provide them to the journalistic, analytical research community so that they can do more work on what's happening, because the occupied territories are so closed off. It is hard, to be fair, for people who are not maybe connected into certain networks to know what information is out there. And I think probably the first job, I do know that a number of governments were planning to do this for years, but they just never did it. I mean, going back even to USA days, so we were going to set up this knowledge platform or this or that, and it just never happened. So I got the funding about 6 weeks ago, and I'm hopeful. There's already a prototype, so I'm hopeful it should all be kind of public within a few months. But basically, I think that people just do need to have access to people, I mean, who are interested in the occupied territories. They don't often get to hear about it very much, or if they do, it's not necessarily in ways where they can sort of feel comfortable maybe with the data or where it comes from. And so that's what we've been working through. And it's been really complicated in terms of like, dealing with the ethical requirements, because they really have to be very, very high given the sensitivity of this issue. And also making sure, that the provenance, that the methodological considerations are really clear for everybody, for the reader, and particularly for academics, because in order for this data to be usable in an academic sense, for peer review, for scholarship, it does have to meet certain requirements. It can't just be, sort of random. So that's one of the aspects that I think needs to be done is just for people to sit down and do that. We're doing that at King's at War Studies, and I'm really pleased that we're doing it. I hope that can be a small part of the answer to fixing that, because it is as well designed with the policy community in mind, hopefully to give them a place where they can go and easily access what is the reality, in terms of child militarization, the different ways that it's happening, some of the different effects, in terms of, let's say, orphans still left in the occupied territories, in terms of, the shadow fleet and its role, grain expropriation. I saw Israel was in the news today because it's been getting grain. Well, it's been getting sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, for a long time from the occupied territories. But so it's, to have all of these different aspects, how the housing is confiscated, in a sort of more empirical way. But I agree with you. I think that there has been a very romanticized idea, maybe sometimes from far away. And it's difficult because at all points, the people in the occupied territories, they also have their agency. And they can choose to, it's their choice to, take certain risks and do different things. I think the important element is just that for us on the other side, we have to be aware of what those risks are, and we have absolutely no right, those of us who are not in the occupied territories, to be asking or to be promoting for people to take those risks. Those people have total agency on the other side to take whatever risk they want, but beyond the intelligence agencies of Ukraine, I don't think anybody else has any right to be asking people who live in those conditions to be taking any risk, especially when I think quite often the vast majority of people have no idea of the sheer level of risk, surveillance, violence that people in the occupied territories are subjected to.
When just surviving, getting through a single day is heroism the like of which we cannot even comprehend. Um, I got a last question. If you do have 2 seconds left, because this is one I really
Mhm.
wanted to fire at you. I know I'm very greedy, but when I get the chance to speak to one of the strongest voices to explain what's going on, going back to your first book and second book, indeed, Putin's war. No, it's Russia's war, not Putin's war. I get that right. The question is very much based on that because you came out with this fascinating idea that Putin doesn't actually shape Russians' views necessarily on foreign policy or Russia's view in the world or Ukraine so much as he is the sum total or the articulation of them, which I think is an extraordinarily powerful idea. But the other idea, what I've been putting forward for a long time now, is that Russians will never come out to defend rights as such, because the conception of rights is completely different than it is in the West, and completely different as it is in Ukraine. But what Russians will, I wouldn't say protest, but what Russians will feel very resentful about is the loss of privilege, either the curtailment of privilege by their own regime, as we saw in the recent sort of internet blockages, or the threat to their privilege, in particular by Ukrainian drones hitting infrastructure and so on. And do you feel that actually the key to victory, there are many keys to victory, but one of them, one of those keys to victory, absolutely, is to make life very uncomfortable for Russians in such that it eliminates or reduces their privileges and their comfort and their sense of security. And then their foreign policy concepts will shift and that message will percolate up. No, we're no longer interested. Like, we wanted Odessa, but frankly, it's not worth it. Can we just go home now?
I think that there's a lot of points to unpack there. I think, yes, I definitely think, I think that it's been a co-creation between, let's say, general Russian kind of sentiment or understanding of Russia's place in the world, across the population. Not everybody, of course, and to differing degrees and different groups. But basically, I think that the Russia that we that that came to be after, between 2012 and let's say up to 2022 was a co-creation. I think clearly the decision to invade Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, was quite clearly taken, only really at the very top level. I think there was a lot of shock, but people were able to accommodate it at the very least, if not outright support it quite easily. Obviously, that's what I write about in the book, so I won't repeat that here. However, I'm not sure that then the corollary kind of follows that because they helped to create this, the Russian people, ordinary Russian people, can now help to sort of dismantle this. Perhaps once Putin's gone, they could. And I do think there's a lot more that can be done to, in terms of strategic communications or narrative modeling, whatever we want to call it, to the Russian people, to help kind of, stress that it would be better for them to deal with some of their problems at home rather than, why do they need to have Odessa, or why do they need to be in Mariupol indeed? Why do they need to have Berezyansk or wherever it is, when they can't, when nobody can get hold of any decent medicine at home? I think that there is messaging that could be done along that side. However, I just don't think, although the Kremlin, we can see, especially from the leaks, most recently, a few months ago, the Kremlin tracks popular opinion very, very closely in Russia. It's always with an eye to moving it more towards what they want to achieve. And ultimately, um, anger, annoyance. I really like your point that it's not about rights, it's about privileges. And if you remove those, I think you're really, I agree with that totally. But I'm just, I'm just not sure, firstly, that you could change the foreign policy preferences to that level, or secondly, whether or not you even need to, can you not just, because the issue that some people have, some of the people who've been most critical, and let's be honest, have brought the most threat, the biggest threat to Putin has, come from like the sort of the turbo patriots or the right, of course, with Prigozhin's kind of mutiny. But I think you need those people do not necessarily have policy preferences that I share. But many of them are angry with the Kremlin because they are unable to fulfill the promises that the Kremlin makes. There's also something to work with there. We don't have to only work with, I think that Western outreach shouldn't only be, or at least messaging shouldn't only be towards people who already completely 100% agree with us. You don't convince people that way. That's just not how it works. But I think there should be more effort to try to understand and find, I don't know, points of resonance with some of the, like, frankly, not necessarily politically very pleasant elements in Russian society, but elements could at least that at least know the reality of the war, know how poorly Russia has performed in that war in some parts, and might be able to raise pressure. Essentially, if we think about it, Russia constantly exploits anything that can add pressure or disagreement within our societies. I'm sorry, but we should be doing the same. Maybe not anything in the way that Russia does, but certainly across certain points.
And it shouldn't be that difficult, frankly, because there's an awful lot wrong in
No, it's a
Russian
very sick
society. Yes,
society. Yeah,
yes,
exactly. It's a very sick society. It would be to be honest with you, it would be so easy if you actually sat
it
down
would
and
be.
wanted to do it, but people don't want to do it.
No, I mean, I talked to Peter Pomerantsev about this, and the idea of combat propaganda is something that we should
Yeah.
be actively engaged in, and which I suspect not. I don't know what programs are on as well. And I mean, the last bit, I guess, is that the regime has probably become dependent on war in a way that it never anticipated. So actually, their wiggle room to get out of it is out less than they would like. They've constricted their options or choices.
It's true, although I don't get the sense they want to come. I think this is really like defining for Putin and his kind of closest elites. I think this is a really ideological, this is about their place in history. They're thinking about centuries from now. They're not thinking about the next electoral cycle because obviously they don't need to worry about such things. I think this is about kind of immortality to a certain extent. So it's just a different conceptualization of what's going on. I think that the second point, though, that I quickly wanted to raise was also we also have a closing window in some ways in the West in terms of doing things because right now, let's say, the millennials, the Generation Z, they've grown up with a certain understanding of how things are that's been more open. The new generation that are currently being trained, sent to Voyin or warrior camps um, to learn how to shoot at Kiev, to learn, the huge militarization that's going on within the school curriculum, that's going to have a really terrifying effect. And as time goes on, it will be more and more terrifying because the children will have been taken, or subjected to this earlier and earlier. And we know that the earlier a child is subjected to this and more consistently, obvious, I mean, it's no huge surprise, the bigger the impact is going to be. So that's also, something that we need to worry about for at least, in the next from 5 years, because who is Russia still planning to be fighting Ukraine in 5 years? I don't believe so. So who are these people who are these soldiers currently children? Who are these children going to grow up to be soldiers against?
That's it.
Again, I feel like these are questions that we are not asking ourselves seriously enough.
And there are a lot of former Soviet territories which probably should be thinking the same things as well. Uh, Jade, what a tremendous privilege to be able to have such a long and in-depth conversation. I know we touched on all sorts of things, but I feel there's a certain cohesion and it all sort of comes together with a
Oh,
simple message that we need to wake up and we
yeah.
need to, as we've both felt since the start of this, learn from Ukraine, not simply support it, learn from it. And that has only got stronger and stronger and stronger. Stay safe. Thank you so much. You do extraordinary work. And I hope everyone in the channel adds extremely positive comments to that and engages more fully with your work as well. Jade, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Lovely to see you.
Let's unpack the book, The Dark Heart of Russia, because it helps to explain how we got to this point. It's edited by me, Jonathan Fink, the creator and host of the Silicon Curtain podcast. It's published this month by Gibson Square in London and is already available for order and delivery online, though officially the PR release will coincide with the Phantom Victory Day parade in Moscow on May the 9th. 30 interviews, 30 voices selected from over 1,000 interviews that have been conducted on this channel. And the lineup that we have put into this book reads like a who's who of the people Moscow would most like to silence. Bill Browder, Garry Kasparov, Fiona Hill, General David Petraeus, Peter Pomerantsev, Luke Harding, Mark Galeotti, Keir Giles, Anders Puck-Nielsen, Alexander Etkind, Yuri Felshtinsky, General Ben Hodges, and many, many more. And with a strong set of Ukrainian voices included, it could be no other way. Volodymyr Ermolenko, Alena Holoshka, Sasha Dozhik, Olga Tokariuk, and Alexander Romantseva, among several others. And the timing is not accidental. We are releasing this book precisely as the Kremlin's central myth, the myth of Russian victory, Russian strength, Russian inevitability, is being shredded in real time. Ukraine matters, and I think this book matters, and our support for Ukraine is the only way of stopping Russian imperialism from its eternal outward expansion and the destruction that it brings in its wake.